Chulin 54a, a couple lines down. Yosef Rabbi Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Marta Kameder of Nachman Yosef V'Komar. Drusa Shamo Tzurcha Bediko Kaneged B'nei Me'ayim. Animal gets clawed, you have to check for redness by the flesh adjacent to the intestines. Rav Nachman Amar Elohim Moribo Rav Mikapo V'Ad Atmo. Rav Nachman said that Rav would teach actually differently. That has to be checked from the hollow to that of from the flesh around the hollow to that of the thigh. Mai kapo, what does it mean the hollow? Ile ma kapo dido. If you're talking about the hollow of the foreleg, meaning its shoulder, then the area between it and the thigh is the same as the area adjacent to the intestines. Ile ma kapo dido, hainu keneged b'nei me'ayim, elo mi kapo de mocha ad atome. So rather, Nachman. So then what is Rav Nachman really talking about? From the hollow of the brain, meaning the skull, to the thigh. It needs to be checked for redness. And Rashi says on that, Kaf hagugolis dehainu kol hacholol ve'af keneged hasimanim. Also by the area of the simanim. Okay. Kisalik Rav Chia bar Yosef. When Rav Chia bar Yosef went up from Babylonia to Eretz Yisrael, he found Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish were sitting and saying, Drusa she'amru tzricha bediko keneged b'nei me'ayim, a clawed animal about which they said one must be concerned requires inspection adjacent to the intestines. Amar lehu Elohim mori bo Rav mikapo v'ad atmo. But he said, Rav Chia bar Yosef said, by God, Rav would teach that must be inspected from the flesh around the hollow to that of the thigh. To the thigh. Amar le Rish Lakish, Manu Rav. Who is Rav? V'lo yadano le, I don't know him. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, v'lo nehiro le lo iso talmid sheshimesh es Rabbi Rabbo. Yochanan said to him, but don't you remember the student who served the great Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and Rabbi Chia and studied under them? Elohim, and by God, all those years that the student served in yeshiva, he was held to be one of the most important students and was allowed to sit during the study. Ani shemashti b'amido, I served standing. Uman gavar, and who is greater? Hu gavar bekola, he was greater in all things, Torah and piety. Miyad patach Rish Lakish Amar, immediately Rish Lakish began to speak and said, indeed, that man, Rav, is remembered for the good. As they say the halacha in his name, if an animal's windpipe is dislocated from the throat and it has already been slaughtered, and we don't know which came first, that it's kosher because it's impossible if the simanim was dislocated to do shchita. Rabbi Yochanan, it's dislocated a windpipe. If this windpipe we're talking about is dislocated. Rabbi Yochanan says, Yovi Yaakov. Rabbi Yochanan says, this is not certain, he disagrees. He says one should bring a windpipe and make a new slit in it and compare the two slits. If they are similar, then the first slit by the slaughtering knife was also made after the windpipe was dislocated and the animal was a treifa. Rashi says, Vikov yichatcheno b'makom acher, cut in a different place, the same windpipe that apparently. Im domin marein shechatochim treifa, if there's similarity in the cuts, it's treifa, the domin, since they're similar, we will say, shavchot acharishon leachar ikor nasa, the first cut was also done after the windpipe was dislocated. Amar Rav Nachman, lo shanu elo shelo tafas besimonim. Nachman said this is only impossible to do shchita on the simanim when they're dislocated. That's only if you don't grab onto the simanim. But if you grab onto them, you're holding onto them, then you can do shchita and they're not going to slide. You're going to do a proper shchita. Then it would be possible that even though it's been dislocated, it still will be properly shechted. Okay. Zeh klal. This is the law. Now, just a moment before, when it said, when he said that, he quoted Shmuta v'ushchuta kshera she'ef shel shmuta shetiyase shchuta. Rashi says there, Nimtzes gargeret shmuta. If the trachea is shmuta, ushchuta and shechter, then yadua im koden shchita nishmata. We don't know if it was before or after. So Rashi specifies trachea, which is the way the Safari read it. Okay, we'll go weiter. Zeh klal asuya mai. The Mishnah says this is a principle. An animal that was injured such that an animal in a similar condition could not live for an extended period is a treifa. Zeh klal asuya mai. What does it come to include by that words of zeh by that ribui of an animal that was injured, etc., etc.? Lasuya shav shmaisasa comes to include the 7 halachos of treifos taught by a moraim and not listed in the Mishnah. These cases are enumerated on page 42b. Devei Yosef Rishba Machu Begido Anashi Vikatli. The men of the house of Yosef the hunter would strike the sciatic nerve of an animal with an arrow and kill it that way. In other words, the animal would die from the wound. They came before Rabbi Yehuda, also the commander of Yehuda and Beseira Amar Lehu, and he said to them, in other words, they wanted to know if the animal that has that injury and you shecht it, is it a treifa? You're gonna, what are you adding to the treifos? Whatever the list is, that's it. Don't add. Only what the rabbi says a treifa is a treifa. Shooting an arrow in the sciatic nerve is not a treifa. Rav Papa bar Abba Rishba, likewise, the men of Rav Papa bar Abba, the hunter, would strike an animal in the kidney. Machu bekuli vekatli, and would kill the animal. Also, they came to Rabbi Abba. They came to Rabbi Abba, Amalahu. They wanted to know also if the animal gets shechted before it dies, is it treifa? Bechila isif ala treifos. Yes, she's supposed to. What are you adding to the treifos? And lechoyla mashamanucham. Since the rabbis did not list that, they do not. That is not a treifa. The ha'kol chazinon de komei. So you see the animal dies from the damage. So isn't that a proof that it is in fact a treifa? Kamiri the ibadri lo samachaya. We have a tradition that if you put medicine on that wound, the animal will heal. The eluk sheres v'hema, and these are the animals that are kosher. Nikva hagargares o shenisteka, or the injuries that it's still kosher, it's not a problem. If there's a hole in the throat, in the trachea, o shenisteka, or there's a cut, a slit downwards, ad kama techasar, how much can be missing out of the trachea and it's still kosher? Rav Shimon Gamliel Aimer ad ke'isrei talki. Rav Shimon Gamliel says it can have up until the size of an Italian iser, and it will still be kosher. We're going to see later in the Gemara that there's a rabbi is going to say that this means ad v'lo ad vichlal, that it says it'll be kosher up until the size of an iser talki that is missing, but that means ad means less than an iser talki, up to but not including. Once it reaches the size of an iser talki, it's going to be considered as if it was more than that, and it's treifa. So when it says ad, it means ad v'lo ad bicha. At least according to one rabbi that we're going to discuss today. What if the skull got broken, but there was no perforation of the membrane of the brain? I'm not sure if this means the membrane that is attached to the skull on the inside, or the membrane that actually is covering the brain itself. But be that as it may, maybe we'll discuss that tomorrow in the Gemara. Nikov halev v'lo lebeis chalala. So Rashi just says about nifchas hakugal. So etzem nifchas v'roin anu shelo nikav hakrum. We see that there's no hole in the membrane. Okay. Nifchas hakugal v'lo nikav krum shel mayach. Nikav halev v'lo lebeis chalala. What if the heart has a hole, but it doesn't go all the way to the inner chamber, or to one of the inner chambers? Nishbara hashidra. And I think we said that they're talking about the left ventricle, which is the biggest chalal space from the two spaces in the heart chambers. I believe so. Nishbara hashedra v'lanifsuk achut shelo. What if the backbone was broken, but not the spinal cord? Nitla kaved. What if the kidney was removed and ishtar meno emeno kazais, but you have an olive bulk of kidney left in the animal? Hamisas ubeis hakoisos. Similarly, it is kosher if the omasum or the reticulum was perforated one into the other. If the spleen was removed, nitlu haklayos, if the kidneys were removed, nita lechi hatachton, if the lower jaw was removed, nitla ha'em shela, if the womb of the animal was removed, the charuta b'dei shomayim, or if the lung shriveled by the hand of heaven, the animal's kosher. Hagluda, if the animal whose hide was removed, Rabbi Meir Machshir Meir says it's kosher. V'chamim Poisli, and the rabbis say it's not a treif. Itmar, we learned these are the treifos. We talked about Mishnah begins and these are kosher, while the previous Mishnah says these are treifos. With regards to this, it was stated that Rabbi Yochanan says, Itmar, Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Elu treifos dafka. When it says in the previous Mishnah, Elu treifos, it means specifically these are treifos and not others. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish Amar, Elu ksheros dafka. And Rabbi Shimon says, no, when it says Elu ksheros, it means these specifically and not others. And the point is that, according to Rabbi Yochanan, Elu treifos is a diuk, is intended specifically to be interpreted as an implication that a particular case is not a treifa, which we're going to see which case that is. And Rabbi Ishlakish disagrees about that particular case, and he holds that the word elu ksheros is intended specifically to imply that that particular case is not kosher. What is this case that they're arguing about? But they're of Masna. The case of Masna. The Amar of Masna says, Hoibuko de atmo de shaf meduch de treifa. Because Rav Masna said, the head of the femur that was completely dislocated renders the animal a treifa. So I read online that if this happens to a cow, you have to hurry up to treat it, try to put it back in place. They might be able to do manually. If not, they have to do surgery. If you leave it too long, it could damage, I think, arteries or nerve. And so it's important to try to do that quickly to heal it, to cure it. Okay, so at least at this point, the Gemara is saying there was a machlokes. Perhaps it may have been based on the idea of whether it was healable, as we saw before, a different case where it was said as a tradition you could put a remedy and heal some injury, and if you didn't, the animal will die, but if you could cure it. Okay, so Rav Masna said that it's a treifa. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Rabbi Yochanan said, Elu treifos davko. Rabbi Yochanan said it says Elu treifos means specifically these are treifos, and he disagreed. Rabbi Yochanan disagreed, did not accept Rav Masna's statement, and therefore Rabbi Yochanan felt that the Mishnah is teaching us that Rav Masna's case is not a treifa. Maybe felt that as a general rule, it's without too much hardship, the animal can be has a good probability of survival. Tana treifos. So El treifos davka, Tana treifos, utana ze'aklal. So Rabbi Yochanan says, it says El treifos specifically. It meant specifically, and the Tana taught in the list of treifos and taught afterwards, this is the principle. So Tana treifos and Tana zaklal, to add cases that were not said explicitly. We mentioned the Shev Shmais, so the 7 cases brought by the Mamarayim. But once Rabbi Yochanan has explained the way he thought that the Mishnah was prepared. That first, the Tana taught what the treifos were. He didn't write Elu treifos, just wrote what the treifos were, and then he wrote Ze'aklal. And then v'chazio leader of Masna, he saw the case of Masna, and he said this people could think that this is included in Ze'aklal, and therefore it's a treif as well. Ma'itama, why? The damil netule, because according to Rabbi Yochanan, it's similar to cases of netule, cases of where something gets removed. The damil netule, the masnisim, our Mishnah says Rashi, the netula he umina treifus hu kedaminon benita lakovet. Like we say, if the liver is taken away, we said Nela Trefos. I don't remember what we said in Nela Trefos as far as what may have to remain for it to be still okay. But here I believe we say if you have an olive bulk, it'll still be kosher. But it's listed also in the Mishnah over there, the idea of removal of the kidney. And therefore he said removal of the femur from its socket is similar to removal of a kidney. And therefore people are going to say, Ze'aklal, that it comes to include, it's also a treifa. Tano, therefore he put the words in the beginning of the Mishnah, Elu treifos, these are the treifos, to imply that there's one case that specifically is excluded, and that's the case of Masna. Hani hu the treifa, the Masna kshera. Rabbi Shimon Lakish Amar, Elu ksheres dafko. He says the other way. He says, when it says the Elu ksheres in our Mishnah now, these are, means bedafko. Tano treifos. So first, he says the Tana in the previous Mishnah, the Tana wrote the treifos, the list. The Tana ze'aklal, he wrote ze'aklal, which is a generality, an amplification. The Chazal of Masna, and he saw that the case of Masna, the lo asyu beze'aklal. He said, oh, they're not going to include that in ze'aklal. Why? Ma'itama lavdin kubedame, because it's not quite similar. Removing of the hip bone from the socket is not really quite like a hole in an organ. Lo lefsuke damya, and it's not really cutting something. It's not really of a cutting situation. And it's not quite really a removal, because I mean the bone is still through the skin, it's still attached apparently to the animal. It's just limping or whatever, or crouched, but it's still it's there. It's just not in its place. So it's not quite the same like netule of the kidney, which is actually apparently an actual real removal. So therefore, you figure it's not going to be. It's what? It's not. He wants to. Rish Lakish thought that the Tana would want to include it, make it kosher, and therefore, wait a second. He would want to make my Tama. So he said, that it would not be considered similar to the Elu Treifos. But he wanted to make sure that people understand that it is treif. Tano eliksheros, that's why he said eliksheros, hani udiksheros, other mason treifa. So when he wrote this Mishnah, he put eliksheros to imply that of masna is a treifa. It belongs in the category of treifa. In other words, here, these are the ksheros, but there's one that's not ksheros, and that's a treifa, that's the Nasna, and that should be included in the list with the previous Mishnah of Elu treifos, but it's not quite similar to the riboy, so people aren't going to realize that it should be included. So he included in the list of treifos by putting Elu ksheros, which is to imply that the Rav Masna case is a treifa. Okay. Gufa, we learned. Amar Rav Masna said, Hoi buka de atma, and also point out that they look share by saying eluk sheros, you're saying, honey, these on our list of sheros, netule sheros. There's some nitulim taking away things that are kosher. Nitat chol, Rashi said, take away the spleen, the klayos, the kidneys. Just yerech, the masna, but taking out, meaning taking the bone out of the femur or the socket, is not going to be a taking. That's going to be a kosher taking. That's going to have to be, even though he's explained that it's not really considered, it's not really a full taking. Rashi says, you're not totally taking out, just moving out of place. Be that as it may, in Eluk Sheres, it's intended to be a implication that the Masna one is in fact a treifa. Gufa Amar of Masna said, Hoy buko de atma de shafmi duchte treifa. The head of the femur that was completely dislocated renders the animal a treifa. Ve'Rava Amar kshera, and Rava says the animal is kosher. Ve'ifsuk ni treifa, but if its sinew holding the bone in place is cut before it can be popped back into the place, if that's possible. In the meantime, you have the sinews holding it in place. If that gets cut, then it's for sure a treifa. That would be Rava's view. Now, as if without cutting the sinews, it's still kshera, but once you cut the sinews, it's treifa. The hilchasa, and the law is, if siknami kshera, the law is that even if you cut the sinews, it's still kosher. Ad she misachlo itachule, unless the sinew is decomposed, in which case the animal is a treifa. Ad kama techsar. Mishnah says, how much can the windpipe be missing and still be kosher? Amar Zira says, asun de lo mit chamei lechon shiura. Rav Shimon Gamliel says, until the perforation is the same size as an Italian Isser. Zeiri, who came from Eretz Yisrael, with regards to this, said, you who are not familiar with the measure of Italian Isser, because it is not used in Babylonia, should estimate the measure with a Kurdish dinar. Amar Zeiri, atun de la mid chamei lechon shiura shiurei bedinrei kurdina vave kepshita zu tarti, and it is like a small pruta coin. Umishtachecha beinei peshite de Pompedisa, and can be found among the prutos of Pompedisa. Amar Rabbi Chana Petura, Chana the money changer said, Ila mina hava koi bar nafcha. Bar nafcha was Rabbi Yochanan, who was standing over me, and he requested of me a Kurdish dinner with which to measure treifus. Uba mine dinara kurdana lishiura beit treifasa. I want to stand before him, he didn't allow me. Amar Li, he said to me, Sheb b'ni Sheb, sit, my son, sit. Ein bali umni os v'shayim la'amod mipnei tamid chacham b'shal she'asu l'kim malachtam. People are working, are not allowed to stand out of respect for Talmid Chachamim while they're doing their work. V'lo, why? The Gemara says, really not? Why not? V'lotarah, didn't we learn kol bali umnios omnim pneim, that when people would come to Eretz Yisrael and Shalosh Regalim, so people come up, so the workers in Eretz Yisrael are supposed to stand up and say greet the people coming up to Eretz Yisrael, doing or the regal, v'shoalim, b'shloima, and ask them, how are they doing? They say to them, achenu ad shemakom ploini boachem b'shalom. Oh, brothers from such and such a place, welcome. Amar Rabbi Yochanan said, "Mipneim omdim." For them you stand. Mipnei Talmidei Chacham and omdim, but not for Talmidei Chachamim. Amar Rabbi Yossi bar Avin, Bo re kama chaviv mitzvah b'shaisa. You see how important it is to do a mitzvah at the right time. They're in the middle. People are doing mitzvah or the regal. You stand up for them. Talmidei Chachamim, you don't have to. Not while you're working. Sha'arei mipneim omdim, mipnei Talmidei Chachamim and omdim. Mimai, the Gemara rejects the statement of Yossi bar Avin. From where does one know that they rise out of respect? Maybe the reason they stand is so that they should not refrain for coming in the future. Maybe that's the reason. Rashi says, if you don't show a nice face, and respect, they're not going to want to come because the hassle to come up. So maybe it's just it's something different than just showing them respect for doing the mitzvah. It's just so that they shouldn't be discouraged because it's a difficult mitzvah. Amar of Nachman said, "Kesela kiyesem mikesela." When it says in the Mishnah that it's kosher as long as it's up to the size of a perforation, the size of a windpipe of an Italian isser, kesela kiyesem mikesela. That when it says kesela, if you reach a sela, it's already like more than a sela. So it has to be less than a sela. Ke'isar kiyesem ke'isar. And similarly, just like the rabbis say, in a different, here in the trachea, it's the isser. But in other cases, they talk about damaged skull for purposes of trephus. They talk about a sela. It means, when it says a sela, it means that, and if it's less than a sela, it's gonna be that you're gonna have the tuma over there. The trephus. So we're talking about, as far as it says trephus, even an area exactly the size of a sela is treated as more than a sela. In other words, if it has the size of a sela missing, then it's already going to be a treifa. If it's less than a sela, means up to sela means not including a sela, then it's not going to be a treifa. Once it reaches the size of a sela, it's already a treifa. Kesela ke'yeser mikesela. Ke'isar kiyesem mikesar. And here, when it says that the trachea up to an isser is kosher, it means up to but not including, means less than isser, because once it reaches an isser, that's already considered like more than isser. So al maksavar of Nachman ad v'lad bichlal. So it means Rav Nachman is understanding the Mishnah that when it says up to something, it means up to but not including. To be continued.